in the Reynard village of Dunmurry Hollow, where peat smoke stains the air and the church bells haven't rung since the war. A sealed estate was auctioned off in 1938. Inside its rotting attic, behind a wall of moth-bitten hymenals, they found a child-sized coffin punched with breathing holes and lined in velvet stitched with scripture. Local records call it a mourning artifact, yet all birth and death certificates tied to the house were quietly erased by the Ministry of Health in 1941. I have obtained the coroner's unredacted logbook. If you're ready to uncover what even the church denied, type "I'm ready" in the comments. The lock gave too easily. Callum Rees hadn't intended to climb into the attic. He hadn't even noticed the door until the second week of demolition, when the wallpaper began to peel like scabbed skin from the upstairs hallway, revealing a small iron-handled hatch flush with the ceiling. It had no key, just for rusted nails and a seam that bled shadow. He stood on the ladder longer than he meant to, his fingers resting on the latch. Rain pressed against the windows behind him, the kind that pulled slow against the glass and made everything look older, smaller, forgotten. The attic hadn't been marked on any plans, not in the 1908 estate blueprints, not in the ministry's survey from 1946, not in the deeds sold to his firm last spring. It shouldn't have been there, and yet it was. When he pulled the hatch open, a smell met him, sweet, milk-heavy, souring, like something maternal, but wrong. He climbed up. The attic was low-ceilinged, rafters hunched like old shoulders, dust moved in the air like breath, slow and suspended. The single window had been blacked out with oilcloth nailed from the inside. He found a switch on the wall, flicked it, and a single bulb shivered awake. It cast everything in a low yellow glow, and the shadows didn't retreat, they only shifted their stance. Boxes, hymenals, some gutted, others swollen with mildew, glass jars with doll parts and hair pressed into salt. One corner of the room had been lined with velveteen drapes, green, black, and moth-eaten, tied with a child's rosary, and at the center, as if placed for private viewing, was the coffin. Child-sized, velvet-lined, breathing holes drilled like rosary beads into the lid, 9 of them, precise, deliberate. Callum stood over it, without speaking. The silence was too complete, like the room had been vacuum-sealed by time. He touched the wood with the back of his hand. It was cold but not dusty. Someone had wiped it clean. Recently he knelt. Scripture had been stitched into the velvet lining, not printed, not carved, stitched, hand-threaded Latin, in reversed lettering, mirror-born and difficult to follow, unless you squinted. Phrases from the Psalms, mostly, but wrong, reordered. The lines didn't bless, they warned. Et nan respondebit, dormit in pace, respirat, ad hoc, and he shall not answer. He sleeps in peace, he breathes still. He opened the lid. It was empty, but the fabric held the impression of a body, small, a child's weight, not decomposed, not rotted, just absent, like the velvet had cradled something for so long that absence itself became form. He reached out and touched the shape. The lining was warm. He recoiled, looked at his fingers. They came away wet, but not with blood. Milk, thin, sour, clinging to the skin like sap. That was when he saw the journal, tucked beneath the coffin, wrapped in oilcloth, sealed with red wax, brittle and cracked at the edges. There was no name, only an ecclesiastical seal, half-burned, and the impression of a rope. A hangman's knot. He took it without meaning to. The attic pulsed once, then went still. There were no dates inside the journal, no page numbers, just a child's hand, small, careful letters in brown ink that slanted as though written by candlelight, and drawings. Cribs without children, a nun holding a spoon too close to a child's lips, a pair of lungs stitched into a pillow. He turned the pages slowly. They said I stopped breathing. They said I was buried, but I remember the hymns. I remember the milk. The breathing holes were my stars. I counted them. 1, 2, 3, all the way until my name wasn't mine. I'm not supposed to write anymore. My hands make too much noise. The last page held only a single image, a velvet veil, drawn halfway back, something behind it, no face, just breath, drawn in lines like a map. Beneath it, a name had been started and scratched out, so violently that the page was torn. The wax below flaked red as dried blood. Callum closed the journal. He stood, ears ringing with the silence of the attic. That kind of silence that comes only in places meant to forget what they once held. A sound behind him. He turned. Nothing. Only the hymenals. One had fallen open. He didn't remember touching it, but it lay now like a wound, its spine cracked, pages fluttering against the floor despite the stillness. Latin script, this time printed, not stitched. A marginalia note caught his eye, different handwriting, harder, angular. This record was sealed by the local diocese in 1889. No explanation given. Callum backed toward the hatch. Each step sent echoes bouncing off the rafters. He didn't want to be there anymore. Not in that room, not under that bulb that flickered with a pulse he couldn't trace. As he turned to descend, his boot struck. Something small, a rattle of glass and metal, a child's milk tooth, capped in silver, threaded onto a rosary. He left it there, down the ladder, down the stairs, all the way to the front door, where the rain still clung to the windows like grief. He didn't know what to say. Not to the others, not even to himself. But that night, the velvet smell clung to his bedsheets. And in the morning, he found a single thread of Latin script, caught under his fingernail, reversed respirat, ADHUC. He breathed still. The ledger arrived, wrapped in oil paper, as if it still feared the rain that had nearly undone it. Callum didn't recognize the handwriting on the parcel. He only knew that it wasn't supposed to exist. No one at the county records office had acknowledged it when he asked. One woman, elderly, blind in one eye, had merely whispered, "Not that house," and walked away with a limp that made her shoes stutter. He didn't open it right away. The parcel sat on the kitchen table for 3 days, gathering dust and the scent of boiled linseed from a cracked jar near the sill. Every time he passed it, he felt a pulse behind his eyes, a memory he couldn't name, like the echo of a smell from a place he'd never been. When he finally unwrapped it, the paper tore like wet skin. The book beneath was heavier than it looked, bound in peeling calfskin, swollen with age and water damage. One of the brass corner plates had rusted, staining the pages with a slow red bloom. The year etched on the inside cover, 1938. Beneath that, coroner's log, Sutton Region, Ministry of Clinical Records, stamped twice, once in ink, once in wax, both broken. Callum turned the pages slowly. The entries were written in the same hand, a thin, looping script that leaned slightly to the left. Some pages had warped so badly they clung together like lovers buried too long. June 3, 1938. Male, 47, found in root cellar, missing tongue. June 9, 1938. Infant, presumed stillborn. Skin bore signs of post-mortem baptism. Entry disputed. The ink changed at entry 41. June 15, 1938. Unnumbered parcel retrieved from Ashford Estate attic, marked for cleansing, no sender. Vessel of ironwood, child-sized. Exterior, drilled vents, 6. Interior, velvet lining, reversed Latin hymnals sewn into fabric. Contents, undisclosed per ministerial writ. Coroner's observational note, vessel was warm to the touch. Slight pulsing sensation noted in lining. Odor faintly sweet. Anomalous response. Faint condensation formed near lid after exposure to ambient air. No visible body present. Recording officer D. Griggsand. Then, in a darker hand, written in the margin, she blinked, twice. Callum sat still, breath caught in the curve of his throat. He reread the phrase 3 times, tracing each letter like a wound. The lamp above the table flickered only once. Then again, some pages beyond, the ink dissolved into water damage. Blots shaped like fingers or teeth. Some words remained legible only by implication. The suggestion of syllables bled into the parchment. But between the blotches, something emerged. A crude drawing. Pencil. A coffin cross-section. Inside, lungs. Anatomically correct. Threaded, with rosary beads instead of veins. Beneath it, another note. Different ink. Shaking hand. There is a difference between sleeping and being permitted to remain asleep. Callum ran his fingers down the center of the page. The ink bled onto his fingertip, wet again despite the age. He rubbed it against his thumb and smelled it. Not ink, milk. The bulb above him buzzed, then died. He sat in darkness, not absolute, the kind of dark that still carries outlines, edges. The ledger on the table looked larger now, or closer. He lit a match. The flare caught a shard of the chandelier's old crystal, casting fragments across the walls, a child's shadow among them, faceless, unmoving. He flipped the next page, a new script, stilted, childlike. They told me the bell meant I could go home. They lied. I don't want to sleep anymore. They stitched my name in the lining. I don't remember what it was. The page smelled faintly of soot. A smear of something brown crossed the bottom edge, faded, but unmistakable. Blood. Callum turned the page. It was blank. He turned again. Blank. Again. Still blank. Until a single word, centered, pressed into the page rather than written: observe. He heard the breath before he felt it. Behind him, small, steady. He turned fast. The chair behind him remained empty, but the rosary on the mantel had moved. It now hung in the shape of a noose. On the page, ink had begun to rise again, slow, like being written under water. New words appeared. They didn't bury her name. They baptized it. Callum stepped back. The match burned down to his fingers, and he dropped it. The ember hissing against the stone floor. Smoke drifted upward, but not from the match. The ledger steamed. Moisture beaded along the spine. Not water. Milk. Callum backed away. Farther. One step, then two. His heel hit the baseboard. The book closed itself gently, and from the page beneath, just before the covers met, a sound, a gasp, shallow, wet, like a child waking from too many years of dreaming. He didn't return to the table that night, but in the morning, he found the ledger back in its parcel, rewrapped, dry, unmarked, except for one change. The address label now read in his own handwriting, and below it, in the corner, scribbled in childish scrawl, so faint he almost missed it, were two words: tell them. The first bell fell silent just before the child opened her mouth. Dunmurray's Easter Vigil of 1915 had begun, under heavy fog, and ended under silence. It was not a silence born of reverence, but of something thick, unnatural, like wool pressed to the ears. Even the old women who never knelt without wincing did not hear the final blessing. The fog had come too quickly, had crept down the bell tower rope and up the nave like a hand. Sister Morwenna felt it in her joints before she saw it. The child had been waiting at the stone threshold, when they opened the nave doors to light the paschal candle, bare feet black with soil, dress soaked to the hips, no guardian in sight. Her hair was plaited but uneven, as though someone had begun and forgotten. No one remembered her entering. No one recalled her name. Who brought her? Someone whispered. No one answered. They let her stay. Of course they did. It was Easter. The priest, Father Harrow, placed a shawl around her shoulders, though it slipped again and again, as if her skin would not hold cloth. And when the choir rose for the opening hymn, the girl opened her mouth and hummed, not in harmony, but in mimicry, as if recalling sound from somewhere she had never truly heard it. That was the moment the bells stopped. There was no toll, no clamour, just absence, the kind of absence that hums. Brother Leoric climbed the bell tower that night, and did not come down when they found him the next morning. He was seated against the wall, eyes open and dry. His mouth was packed with crumbled hymnals. No blood, no bruising. The bell rope was frayed an inch above his hand, as though it had split of its own volition. The girl did not speak for 3 days. She stayed in the sacristy, humming through closed lips, always the same rhythm, slow, too slow for any hymn. Father Harrow tried baptism. It was Good Friday. The font had not been cleaned. The water was still fog-pale from the vigil. He asked her name. She did not respond. He dipped his fingers, made the sign of the cross, and when he touched her forehead, the water sizzled, not boiled, sizzled, like milk poured on iron. She blinked once, then smiled, not cruelly, not joyfully, just ... Finally, the next morning, the baptismal record was found reversed. The ink crawled backward across the page, names unspelling themselves by Sunday. Parishioners began to fall ill. It was not dramatic, just the small sicknesses that gather in corners, weeping eyes, hair loosening in handfuls, blood in the mouth upon waking. Sister Morwenna coughed up thread for 3 days, and thought it penance. Still, no one asked the child to leave. The girl continued humming, always the same rhythm. Even when the church was empty, those who passed could hear her through the stone. Not words, not melody, just breath over memory. One evening, the curate, young Jonah Farrow, entered the sacristy alone. He had not yet taken his vows. His mother had died the week before in childbirth, the infant still and milky. He returned an hour later, barefoot and humming. His tongue had been removed with ecclesiastical precision. He died the next day. The village began to blame the fog. Fog rot, they called it. A corruption of the lungs, ancient and damp, carried in the bones of the earth. But no doctor arrived. The ministry sent no letters. No carts came for the sick, and still the bells did not ring. In the tower, the mechanisms rusted over in a weak iron turned black, rope unbraided itself. Cracks appeared in the icon of St. Agnes. Her painted eyes wept soot. During Mass, no matter the sermon, flies gathered at the pulpit. One evening, as light poured through the stained glass in bleeding shafts, Sister Morwenna caught the girl whispering to the cloth of the altar, not praying, whispering, like trying to remind it of something it had once known. When asked who she was speaking to, the child replied, "The bell, not a bell, the bell." That night, Father Harrow began to unravel. He walked to the bell tower, and left his shoes at the bottom, climbed barefoot, carrying a thurible filled with milk. The next morning, the rope was gone. The thurible remained, overturned, the milk now ashed. He was never found. By May, the girl had stopped humming. She stood beside the altar during services but did not kneel, did not mouth the prayers. She simply watched. Her eyes did not blink unless spoken to. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, unsure, as though trying to relearn her own shape. "Why do you keep calling him back?" No one answered. That night, the hymnals in the pews flipped open on their own. 2 different pages, every one stained with soot. A week later, Sister Morwenna attempted a second baptism, this time in secret. She believed the first had failed, that it must be redone. She filled a copper bowl with well water, lit a candle, and cut a strip from her veil to wrap around the child's eyes. When she lifted the candle, the flame turned black. The child did not resist. But the next morning, Sister Morwenna awoke in her cell to find her veil stitched across her own mouth, not sewn, stitched by hand, thread drawn through the gums, still fresh with blood. She survived, but she never spoke again. The veil was never removed. They say the girl remained until Pentecost. Then she vanished. No door was opened. Footprint left. Only a crib was found in the sacristy, empty, rocking gently, lined in velvet. No name was ever recorded, but the villagers remembered, not her face, not her voice, only the way her mouth moved when no sound came. And still, even now, the church remains without a bell. Each attempt to replace it ends the same way. The clapper dissolves, the metal warps, and the rope hangs itself, a rope that hums, if you place your ear against it. Not a song, not a hymn, just the sound of something breathing through closed lips. The silk lining did not give way easily. Callum had expected rot, perhaps threadbare decay, but what lay inside the coffin was still damp to the touch, not from water, but from something denser, clinging like memory. When the mortuary technician peeled the first layer of velvet back, the scent lifted like a low, reluctant breath. It smelled faintly of iron, but sweeter, like rust drawn through the mouth of an infant. "Not decomposition," said Dr. Hargreaves. Her voice was calm, practiced, but her eyes didn't meet his. Not entirely, at least. They worked in the pathology wing beneath Ashford's disused sanatorium, the kind of room where nothing truly healed. The walls were painted with old antiseptic, peeling now, revealing plaster the color of dried milk. An old hymn hummed through the broken intercom above the sink, the speaker crackling every few bars like a damaged throat trying to sing. The lab table was stainless steel, but the velvet bled through it anyway, faint rings of moisture forming where the lining touched, as though the silk had learned to leak. "The fibers have absorbed something. Organic," Hargreaves said. She scraped a piece gently into a sterile tube, her gloves trembling just once. When tested, the sample gave back 3 signatures: iron, poppy, resin, breast milk, not human, not completely. Callum stood over the analysis printout, its fluorescent lines slicing the dark like incisions across a prayer book. Something about it unnerved him more than the body they hadn't found. He traced the spike on the breast milk line with his thumb and whispered without meaning to, "Milk does not forget." Hargreaves glanced at him. "What did you say?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the coffin's lining again. His fingers met something stiff, a corner of silk folded back, revealing a seam that was not a seam. Someone had hidden it. Deliberate stitching, reversed, the way veils are made for the dead. He pulled gently, thread catching under his nail, until the hidden pocket opened with a soft, sighing tear. Inside, a single baby tooth, wrapped in yellowed lace, still pink at the root, a tag pinned through the fabric, barely legible. "For Sister Elspeth, 1911, returned to sender." Callum didn't speak, didn't breathe. Hargreaves took the tooth to the back room for testing. She returned 30 minutes later, face drained, a folded piece of paper trembling in her hand. No birth records. Match the tooth, she said. But the enamel density. It's not from an infant. Not exactly. He waited. It's from a stillborn. But the calcium levels indicate stress. The kind you'd see from being buried alive. The room shifted then, not literally, but emotionally, as if the walls had leaned in to hear more. I've seen this before, Hargreaves whispered. Once, during my internship in Dunamari, she sat down on a rusted stool, her eyes glassing over. There was a midwife who died in the war. They found her in a field, covered in veils, with 27 teeth sewn into her skirt lining. Baby teeth, each one wrapped in cloth. Kalam didn't blink. One of them, she continued, was laced to a broken chain. Silver. It matched this. She opened her palm. A chain dot, small, old. The clasp bent. The charm, a bell, cracked through the center, blackened with time. He stepped back. His heel scraped the floor. The sound was swallowed. They sent the tooth for regional matching. The database coughed once, then stopped. One match, a midwife named Elspeth Hawthorne died in 1915. Cause, unknown. Witness statement, redacted. Church record, burned. Only one note survived, scribbled on the back of her funeral card, unsigned. She gave birth to a silence that would not sleep. That night, Callum did not go home. He remained in the pathology wing, watching the coffin. He thought he saw the velvet twitch dot later. When the janitor swept the floor, he found 3 pale threads, long and fine, caught in the drain, as if something had been combed clean beneath the table. The next morning, Dr. Hargreaves didn't come in. Her lab coat was found draped over the sink, pockets inside out. Beneath it, a single bottle of milk, unopened, warm to the touch. No one could explain the bottle's temperature. When Callum unscrewed the lid, the scent made him retch. Not from rot, but recognition. The same scent from the attic. The same scent from the journal, the same scent that had soaked his sheets. Once, when he dreamt of cribs rocking by themselves, in the bottle's condensation, a single print had formed. Small, too small for an adult, barely larger than a doll's hand. He called the diocese registry, asked for Elspeth's file, waited on hold for 17 minutes. When they returned, their voice was thin and strange. That record was sealed by the local diocese in 1889. No explanation given. But she died in 1915, he said. Silence then. Are you certain? Click. When Callum returned to the lab, the velvet had dried, but a shape remained, the imprint of a mouth, not open, pressed closed, as if nursing, and on the table, where the tooth had once been, lay only the charm. The cracked bell did rang once, without being touched, high, distant, like a sound remembered too late. Sister Agnes never knelt after the lullaby began. It wasn't pride that stiffened her spine, not vanity, not even disbelief. It was something older, a knowing, like the marrow of her bones remembered a melody once hummed to them in the womb, and knew what it meant to die slowly to the wrong song. The year was 1927, and the Ashford orphanage had no bells, only ropes that frayed in silence, and children who cried with mouths shut. The curtains behind the altar had not been drawn in 2 decades, thick burgundy velvet, heavy with dust and memory. That's where she first saw the girl, not hiding, not frightened, watching. The other sisters said it was the light, a stained glass trick, but Agnes had lived long enough among false lights to know when it moved wrong. The girl never blinked. Her silhouette, pale and upright, did not shift with the candles or sway when the windows opened. She simply stood behind the curtain, hands at her sides, waiting. At first, Agnes thought it might be one of the orphans, Ada, perhaps, the silent one who walked with her shoes unlaced. But Ada had freckles, and a limp. And this girl had no age at all. One evening, during Compline, a sound rose through the nave, not from the organ, it had not worked in years, but from beneath the floorboards. A melody, small and breathless, like milk dripping into a cracked bowl, a lullaby sung not for comfort, but to hush something alive. Several children fell asleep mid-prayer. One slumped to the stone so softly her skull made no sound. Her lips continued to move, but the words were backward. Sister Agnes kept her eyes open. She would not kneel. The Mother Superior reprimanded her in whispers behind the confessional screen, beneath the rusting crucifix, near the jars of ash. used to mark the penitent. You will kneel to silence. Sister Agnes said nothing, but when she opened her palm that night, she found milk on her skin, not spilled, not poured, beaded, like sweat. She did not wipe it away. On the third day, the lullaby grew louder, not in volume, in weight. It settled into things, into wool, into marrow. It made the children walk more slowly, made the wax in the altar candles drip against gravity. It was then that Agnes began to write. She used the backs of old hymnals, margins of punishment ledgers, the inside of her pillowcase. It is not her song. She is only the throat. She watches, not to be seen, but to remember. The milk stains are never where they began. She tried to burn one of the pages. It hissed, wet. The flame blackened the paper but left the words legible, as though the ink had been carved instead of written. That night, a crib was found in the east corridor. No child had slept there in decades. Yet the lace lining was warm, and a lullaby hummed from beneath the mattress not sung. Exhaled, she lifted the veil, and a tooth rolled out. She took it to the archive, beneath the chapel, where old baptismal records molded in salt-lined drawers, but no name matched. No child lost a tooth, no child born with one. On the ribbon tied to the crib's leg, in memoriam, Sister Agnes. She did not leave. Instead, she watched the curtains. Behind them, the girl remained, each day closer to the veil, not moving but arriving. One morning, Sister Elion, who still believed in saints and silence, tried to kneel mid-prayer. Her knees did not reach the stone. Instead, they bent wrong backward, and her scream rang out so sharp that the glass in the nave cracked along the Virgin's face. The icon wept soot for 3 days. Sister Agnes remained upright. The lullaby paused. Just once, when she passed the nursery, she saw the girl at last, not behind the curtain but seated on the edge of a cot. She was brushing a doll's hair with a needle. The strands caught on the tip, and where they snapped, milk welled up from the scalp. The girl did not look up, but she hummed again, the same song, the one that smelled like sleep and poppies and milk. Turned. Agnes whispered, "What do you want?" The girl blinked once and placed the doll down. She was promised, she said, but they sang instead. Agnes asked, "Promised to what?" The girl smiled, soft and shapeless, to silence. She vanished behind the curtain once more. That evening, Agnes gathered her writings and placed them in a box lined with torn veils and crib sheets. She sealed it with candle wax and tied it shut with threads pulled from the altar cloth. The next day, she was dismissed. They said she had disrupted liturgy, that she had mocked penance, that she had refused to kneel during the children's funeral. There had only been 2 bodies, but 7 names were written in the death ledger. The Mother Superior burned her journals, but the wax refused to melt, and when they buried the 2 children, no one could lift the coffin. It took 3 men. All went pale. One vomited. The other developed a tremor that never left. The third never spoke again, but the stains on his bed never left. Decades later, the confession box was removed during renovation. Behind it, workers found a single hymnal wrapped in milk-soaked linen. Inside, a tooth, a name etched in soot, and the final words Sister Agnes had written. She didn't die. She was remembered. And on the back page, scrawled in trembling hand, they didn't bury her name. They baptized it. The hymnal was never catalogued. It sat beneath a pane of cracked glass in the sacristy storage vault, tucked between rotted choir stalls and a box of infant shoes blackened by soot. No inscription adorned its spine, no gold leaf, no cross, only a threadbare leather cover, warped by age and damp with something that smelled like poppy and milk. Father Merrill had passed it over twice, thinking it an old account book, until the corner caught on his coat and tore. Not the hymnal, the coat. The hymnal held fast, like it had teeth. He brought it to the lightless reading room below the rectory, where the windows had long been sealed with mortar, and the only sound was the slow drip from the ceiling, rhythmic, like something pacing above. The book opened reluctantly, like flesh remembering a wound. Its pages had been sewn shut in clusters, 6, always 6, and the stitching was unmistakably human hair, fine, dark, and knotted in precise double thread, a convent technique, though none that he recognized. The first cluster was blank, the second, 2, but between the third and fourth, someone had inked a single phrase in reversed Latin. She must not wake. He whispered it aloud, involuntarily, and felt his teeth ache. The ink bled into the page, as if resentful of being read. curling into itself like mold under a magnifying glass. He turned to the next page. The hymn there was familiar, the structure, the notation, even the melody lines. But each stanza was inverted, palindromic in rhythm, building not to a crescendo, but to an absence dot at the bottom, a note, different ink, shakier hand. For boys only. Do not hum. Do not breathe between stanzas. The name scratched below was illegible, but it began with a T. Father Merrill exhaled. Slowly, he remembered a list from the diocesan archive, choir rosters from the 1930s. 11 boys had sung that spring. By 1934, all were dead, not from plague, not from accident, from neurological exhaustion, as the records put it. One had clawed out his vocal cords with a communion fork. Another drowned in the baptismal font, with no water inside. The youngest, barely 7, was found curled in the choir loft, cradling a hymnal that hadn't existed until now. The pages began to hum, not aloud, not quite, but he felt it. A resonance behind the breastbone, low and maternal, like something suckling at his lungs. His hands trembled. He turned another page. One line, a hymn without music, only syllables written phonetically. Shola, shola, shola. Stopped, mid-breath. The ink below was smeared with what looked like milk, but it smelled of rust. He leaned closer. The page pulsed. He shut the book. Too late. Bide behind him, a rustle fabric against fabric. He turned. The cracked icons on the wall stared back. The Virgin's face had flaked away, revealing soot beneath the paint. The infant's hand pointed not up, but across, toward the narrow corridor leading to the old choir dormitories. He had not walked that hallway in decades, not since he was 12, not since Thomas strangled himself with his own stole. And yet, now, drawn by a pull older than memory, he walked, the hymnal in his hand, bleeding a thin line of ink from its spine. The corridor was colder than it should have been, and quiet, unnaturally so. Even his footsteps seemed to pause mid-echo, reluctant to linger. At the end of the hallway, the door stood open. The dormitory was unchanged. 8 cots, perfectly made. One rocking chair still swaying, and on the far wall, a handprint in soot, small, childlike, unmoving. He stepped forward. A strand of hair drifted down from the ceiling beam. Then another. Then another. He looked up. The rafters were stitched with it, black threads running beam to beam, forming a net or a womb. At its center, a bundle of cloth, moving. The humming returned. No source, no voice, just presence. He opened the hymnal again, not by choice, but because the book wanted to be read. The next page bore no ink, just a pressed lace ribbon, wrapped around something hard. A tooth, baby-sized. He dropped the book. The humming stopped. From beneath the nearest cot, something rolled out, a thimble, etched with scripture too small to read. Inside it, milk, fresh, warm. He stepped back. The rocking chair halted on the cot. Someone had written in soot. She listened. You sang. Father Merrill turned and ran. He locked the dormitory, then the corridor, then the archive, but the hymnal was still in his hands. He tried to burn it in the courtyard furnace. The flame caught, then retreated. The pages curled, but did not blacken. The stitching smoldered, releasing the scent of scorched milk and bloodied cradle sheets. He buried it instead, beneath the old bell tower, 6 feet down, without prayer, without stone. But 3 days later, it returned, on his pillow, damp, open to the final page. She must not wake. Underneath, a new line freshly inked, but she is already listening. The first tooth clinked against porcelain like the softest bell. Not loud, not sudden, just wrong. The renovator, a quiet man named Lyle, thought it a pebble at first, perhaps dislodged mortar, or a button dropped, decades ago, and forgotten in the pipes. But when he reached in, gloved hand, submerging into the rust-clouded water, he drew out not stone or clay, but enamel, a child's incisor, clean, still rooted. He paused, breath frosting against the cold, metallic air of the Ashford nursery. Wing a corridor that had not heard laughter since 1948. The basin gurgled. He turned the valve. It shrieked like something pleading in Latin, then hissed into stillness. The tooth lay in his palm. And then, behind it, another dot, then 4 dot, then too many. They clattered up through the wash basin, great like fish surfacing through blood, pale, perfect, some still pink at the root. Lyle staggered back. knocking over the rusted cart of tools. One wrench rolled to the threshold of the room and stopped, as if unwilling to cross back in. On the mirror above the sink, his reflection did not move. Dust coiled upward from the floor vents. The room smelled of breast milk and vinegar-soaked gauze. He backed out slowly, teeth still in his palm. Some were impossibly small, not even first teeth, but budding nubs, as if they'd never broken through gums at all, as if the mouth had offered them willingly. Below his boots, the tile bore faint outlines, not quite footprints, but heel-shaped smudges, like a barefoot child had walked there once and dissolved mid-step. The other workers wouldn't follow him in. Not after that. They sent for someone from the diocese. A sister, pale and veiled in grey, arrived with her lips sewn shut, not from injury, but devotion. She nodded only once, stepped inside alone, and left 10 minutes later, the skin beneath, her eyes trembling. In her hand was a single sheet of parchment. On it, written in the margin of an old Ashford ledger, was a phrase circled in red wax: "Self-whoring is not for the tongue." That night, Lyle dreamed of his childhood dentist, except the man wore a cassock, and instead of pliers, he used a censer. He didn't return to the job, but others did. They opened the walls behind the nursery sink, chasing the source of the blockage that had backed up not just water, but memory. Inside, they found the pipes stuffed with gauze, each swatch embroidered with initials, tiny crosses sewn into corners, some still wet, all smelling faintly of rot and milk. Further in, a rosary made from teeth, strung tight, alternating molars and canines. The crucifix carved from a femur too small for an adult. They sealed the nursery, for good, but a year later, during the demolition of the adjoining infirmary, another sink was dislodged out behind it, a cavity in the wall. Within, a porcelain bowl filled to the brim with enamel. Some teeth were blackened with ink, others etched with dates. At the center, a set of shears, surgical, clean, still sharp. One nun, long since retired, finally agreed to speak. Her name was Sister Colette. She was 93, half-blind, and hadn't spoken a full sentence in decades. But when shown a photo of the wash basin, she whispered. She told them the Lord needed something white. They asked who. She would not answer, only added, "We knelt." She did not. Sister Colette died that night, in her mouth, tucked behind the lower molars. The coroner found an object, not a wafer, not a note, but a miniature hymn book, carved from soap. Inside, etched with something sharp, a hymn with no melody, just syllables repeated until the page ran out. Tooth for prayer, molar for mercy. She listens, she eats. The words dissolved on contact with water. The church issued no statement, but weeks later, beneath the boards of the old chapel pulpit, a mason discovered a scrap of linen, child's nightclothing, torn, burned, and soaked in something that smelled of opium and iron. Sewn into the hem, a tooth, a prayer, a silence that had no end. They say the plumbing was replaced. They say the sinks are gone. But if you visit Ashford now, or whatever remains of it, and stand very still in what used to be the nursery wing, you may still hear it. The drip, 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 not water, not quite, and if you open your mouth, just slightly, just enough, you may feel something stir in your gums. Not pain, not pressure, just release. Like offering, like prayer, like the body remembering what it was told to forget. They didn't bury her name, they baptized it. The census book was bound in wet leather, darker than ink, stiffer than old bark, warped like it had drowned and refused to dry. The clerk in Dunmore's records office, a boyish man named Elric, found it when a ceiling tile gave way and spilled mildew, soot, and 2 forgotten ledgers into his lap. One was from 1908, the other, 1909. He opened them side by side, expecting ink rot, blank margins, maybe the sloping loop of a priest's hand, the usual chaos of rural registries in winter years. But what stared back at him was absence, not neglect, not error. Erasure. Line after line had been scraped clean, not crossed, but physically lifted. The fibers of the paper clawed out with something sharp, names replaced with silences, pages ghost pale in vertical bands, where entire family lines had once been where children should have been. The records were not empty. They were devoured. Elric called in his supervisor, a woman named Dervla, who spoke like her bones were tired and always kept a rosary in her coat pocket. She squinted at the pages without touching them. Then she turned to the wall. There was a fire, she said, but not like she believed it. Paper shrinks. It happens. She left without looking him in the eye. But Elric, young and stupid enough to be curious, stayed late. He laid the 1910 book beside the others and found more of the same. Dates without names. Baptisms without birthplaces. Whole households listed as withdrawn. The margins were spotted with oily thumbprints. In one place, the ink had curdled like spoiled milk. Then, near the center of the 1909 volume, barely legible in the dim candlelight, for the overhead fixtures had long since stopped buzzing, he found a slanted annotation scrawled in red. She hums through milk. We must not name her. It was unsigned. The line beneath it had been burned, not scratched, not singed, but burned. Like someone had pressed a taper to it and let it smolder until only black glass remained in the paper's grain. Elric ran his fingers over it. The skin of his palm itched. He turned to close the book, but the room was different. No wind, no sound, just the warm, wrong stillness of milk left too long in a bowl. He looked down. His fingernails were damp. The ink had bled into his cuticles, and from behind, the file shelves, soft, barely breath a hum, like a lullaby, but slower, off rhythm, as if the voice came not from a throat, but from memory forced through bone. He slammed the ledger shut. The hum stopped. The following day, the records office was padlocked. The clerk was placed on extended leave. Official reason: nervous decline. The diocese ordered a review of all documents tied to Ashford Parish and Dunmarry Orphanage, but by then it was too late. The census was declared compromised. The government blamed improper ink treatment. A bishop published an op-ed declaring that blank pages evidence of moral decay among lay recorders. The documents were boxed, sealed, and sent to an archive beneath St. Brevins in Lauren. That archive flooded the following winter. An altar boy drowned in a locked room. Later, after the sub-basement was drained, volunteers found the ledgers, floating upright, spine-down pages blooming open like mouths mid-song. None of them showed damage, except one. The 1908 ledger had split down the middle, inside. Between pages 112 and 113, sewn with milk thread and veiled in waxed linen, was a page that didn't belong, written backward. Translated, it read, "When they sang, she slept. When they stopped, she woke. Do not let her go unnamed. Names are windows. Names are doors." There was a drawing beside it, not a child's, an adult's, detailed, precise. A crib, empty, surrounded by veiled figures, and above the crib, a girl, upside down, floating, her mouth open, her eyes to holes, stitched with thread. When the document was shown to a retired nun who had once taught at Ashford in 1931, she spat blood into her hand and whispered, "That's her. That's her face in the curtains." They tried to interview her again the next day, but she was already gone. Her death certificate bore no date of birth, just a seal, wax, black, of a veiled child holding a hymnal. No one at the diocese claimed knowledge of the seal. A note was left on Elric's desk when he returned, months later, to collect his things. Typed, "Anonymous. We remember the name, but it is the unregistered who stay." He never spoke of the records again. But those who knew him say he stopped drinking milk, refused it, wouldn't touch it, even in tea. Not after that night, and not after the dream that followed. A nursery with no cribs, a song with no melody, and a girl with no age, humming beneath his skin. They burned the ledgers in 1943, but still, sometimes in towns near Dunmarry, the census comes up wrong. A name too many, an age that doesn't matched out a child no one remembers birthing but whose cradle rocks, quietly, when the wind blows west, and if you listen closely, in the breath between church bells, you might hear her humming through milk. By the time they found Thomas Healy, he had already stitched 16 teeth into the altar cloth, Welsh milk teeth, for adult, arranged in the shape of a halo. He'd used fishing line pulled from the chapel's cracked thurible drawer, and the cloth had not bled, but bruised a quiet purple stain beneath each root, as if the linen itself rejected memory. He didn't scream when they came for him. He was humming, not a tune, not quite, just the pattern of breath around something half. He smiled, slow and glassy-eyed, and whispered, "It's Lent, you know." She listens closer during Lent. None of the nurses understood, but one of them, a former parish girl from Lorran, froze. Because she had heard that rhyme before. Not In church, in the nursery. Bite the candle, swallow the wax, tell no one or she comes back. It was a game. That's what they told each other. A game played in winter dormitories with no fire, when the ash still lingered in their hair from Ash Wednesday, and the sisters wouldn't light the hearths, not even for confession. The candles were fat and pale and unscented, carved from beeswax and tallow. They were meant for vigil. But in the girls' wing at Ashford, they became something else. A dare, a test. You'd wait until Vespers ended, and the hall grew soft. You'd pluck the candle from the sconce beside the old Virgin statue, the one with the blackened eyes, and you'd sink your teeth in. Not too deep, just enough to taste smoke, enough to feel her notice. Then you'd chew. The wax never melted, right? It clung to the roof of your mouth like prayer gone sour. You'd gag, swallow, and wait. If you told anyone, it was said she'd come in the dark. Not the nun, not the headmistress, not even the girl with the wrong shoes. Her, the candle girl, she, with the quiet feet and jaw like broken glass. She who hummed behind closed lips and left no shadow. Only one child remembered her properly. Thomas. He had been the smallest of them then, too weak for the hymns, too pale for the beatings. He sang in corners and wept when the bells rang too loud. But he had watched the others, one by one, daring wax to prove itself sacred. He had wanted to be brave. So he tried. It was a Wednesday in March, years ago. Sister Elspeth had left the infirmary door open by mistake. The chapel was empty. A storm rasped low over the rafters, and the candles in the nave trembled as if someone breathed too near. Thomas bit. The wax cracked. Something in it pulsed. He did not chew. He did not swallow. Because beneath the surface of the candle, buried like a splinter, was something soft and round. A tooth, small, human. It lodged between his molars like a threat. He spat blood, and from the veil above the altar something exhaled. That night, he dreamed of linens that whispered his name, and an old woman plucking teeth from her own gums, offering them like rosary beads to a child in white. She had no face, only a candle flame. Where her mouth should be, Thomas never spoke of it. Not then. He carried the dream with him, through school, through parish rites, through the dim corridors of the asylum where he eventually came to live. He told the doctor once. The man laughed, scribbled something about symbolic oral fixation and ecclesial trauma, but the nightmares did not leave. So Thomas began to sew. He used altar cloths left to rot in a disused chapel annex. He stole the teeth from unused caskets in the parish cryptos left behind when burial records lapsed or names fell away. Some were his, most were not. He stitched not in patterns but in prayers, circles, veils, a single word, sewn in tooth marks into the hem of the linen. Listen. On the night they found him, he had filled the candle room with salt. The candles themselves had all been unspooled, softened in heat, reshaped into infant limbs, small and grotesquely posed. Heads bowed. The crucifix above the room had cracked. Down the middle, a thin line of wax dripped from Christ's open palm. No one entered the room for 3 days. When they finally did, they found the hymnal open to an unwritten page, blank, except for one note etched into the parchment's flesh with a fingernail. She didn't ask for worship, only silence. The candle girl was never named, but those from the parish recalled Flicker's a child sent away for biting during communion, a nun whose mouth was wired shut after confession, a fire in the candle works that no one ever rebuilt. Some said it was a test the church created, an invented myth to force obedience. Others, fewer, claimed the wax itself had turned, that it remembered mouths, that it grew teeth when no one watched. Thomas lived 17 more years in St. Malachi's, never violent, never loud. Only once did he speak of her again to a chaplain. She's the lull before the bell, he whispered. The silence between stanzas, that's when she listens. That's when she learns what to become. He died quietly, no cause determined. The linens he embroidered were burned, but one fragment survived, a small corner, rescued by a nurse whose name no one recalls. It now resides in an evidence box at the Dunmurry Archive, labeled Misc, liturgical. If you look closely, just under the seam, you can see it, not thread, root, curved, human, a baby tooth, bitten clean through. It arrived in a padded envelope with no return address. The corner bore the ministry's seal, faded and rain-dragged, the red ink bleeding like something wounded. Inside, a letter unsigned, a second envelope, and the file. The letter read only, Your request has been acknowledged. Contents classified until 2140. Proceed with discretion. The envelope smelled like mildew and iron, and faintly, under it all milk, Elliot Vale, former archivist at Dunmurry Parish, and now the accidental keeper of too many whispered records, unfolded the file with gloved fingers. He had waited 6 years for this one, petitioned with teeth in his voice, cited lineage, loss, and law. He had expected redacted dates. He had expected the ink to be thick, cold, merciless. He had not expected the sketch, pencil on aged linen parchment, a child's coffin, but not a child's, longer, narrow, lined with a mesh of something not metal, not wire, something that almost pulsed. Even in the rendering, annotations ran along the side in clerical shorthand. One circled term repeated 3 times, respiratory housing. Another line below, female, non-human response noted. The page shook. In his hand, the room was quiet. Not the natural quiet of dusk in a rural archive, but a held-breath kind of quiet, as though the wooden drawers knew what had just been disturbed. Dust hung thick in the air, suspended like a congregation waiting for the bell to fall. He turned the page. There, a second sketch. This one showed the coffin open only partially, just enough to see slats where a face might rest. Holes, small, round, breathing holes. But more than that, etched into the inner lining, barely visible, teeth marks, dozens, fine and shallow, as if made not by a single set of jaws, but by a congregation of mouths too small and too many. He dropped the file. It landed with a sound like a hymn, unfinished. Across the room, the old microfilm projector clicked on, unprompted. The bulb inside glowed once, twice, then dimmed. Elliot moved slowly toward it, breath tucked under his ribs. The reel began to spin, projected against the white back wall. A single frame, grainy, flickering, a black and white image of the Ashford orphanage, chapel recognizable by the warped crucifix and the veil that hung always too low behind the altar, and in the foreground boxed, crude, wrapped in linen, and placed atop a trolley used for milk deliveries, a coffin. Its sides were its corners bore tiny ventilation ports. A tag hung from the latch that zoomed in. The letters were faint, but still legible. Subject, not to be buried. Class contained. The film stopped. A low, dragging sound echoed above the ceiling rafters, moaning as if something remembered weight. Elliot didn't move. There had always been rumors about the attic space above Ashford's east wing, that it was sealed after a sickness. That plaster fell like scabs from the ceiling when the rains came. That once, long ago, someone heard a lullaby being hummed from beneath the floorboards, but no child was accounted for, and there were the reports, whispered through diocesan hush orders of interior breathings. That was the phrase, not exhalations, interior breathings, like the building had lungs, like something had been left awake. Elliot gathered the pages back into their envelope. His fingers trembled. He looked again at the annotation beneath the sketch, confirmed auditory mimicry. Phrase repeated, please kneel, she is still becoming. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he laid out the file, page by page, and placed a candle beside it, beeswax, the kind once used for vigil rites. He did not light it, he simply watched it by morning. The candle had changed shape. Where once the base had been smooth, there were now 3 indentations along the bottom, rounded tooth-like, not carved, pressed, as though something had leaned against it in the dark. Something mouthless, but remembering. Elliot made one final call to a colleague at the Dunmurry Historical Registry. He asked about the file number. Not in our system, came the reply, slow. That classification schema was retired in '72. You sure it's authentic? I'm sure, he said, voice dry. It's dated 1929, but the embargo extends to 2140. A pause. That's not a protection date, that's a burial delay. And then, quieter, you should destroy it. He hung up. Elliot packed the file into a new envelope, this one bound in wax thread. He marked it unprocessed and slipped it beneath the floorboard of the chapel record room. The same room where once, according to a forgotten janitor's notes, a sound had been heard through the vent, a soft, rhythmic hum. The same song every time, not joyful, not hymn. Lullaby. And at the end of that hum, a rasp, as if something old had been breathing through cloth. Waiting to be renamed. A month later, the building was closed for renovations. The attic was declared structurally unsound. The parish issued no statements. The envelope remains, and somewhere, perhaps still in the attic, beams or behind the plaster rot, a shape lingers, something to long for a child, too quiet to be called, dead, and marked not for burial, but for classification. Until 2140, they carried the coffin into the mortuary, under a sky that did not move. There was no wind that morning, no sound of birds. Even the hinges on the parish gate refused to creak. If time itself had held its breath to watch, the men wore gloves. But still, one crossed himself when he saw the shape beneath the linen, too thin, too long, the wood discolored like skin after drowning. The cart left wheel marks like bruises on the chapel floor. Inside, the coroner waited. Dr. Rowan Sile had done autopsies for 30 years and delivered his findings with the detachment of someone who had long since abandoned the illusion of mercy. But something about this case, this thing, unsettled him before he even touched it. The records gave no name, no age, no cause, only a handwritten label. Specimen, a female apparent. Do not inject. The chapel's lower chamber had been converted into an examination room after the war. Rusted hooks still hung in the rafters. A rust-colored stain bloomed like a moth-wing across the floorboards beneath the altar. Dr. Sile placed his instruments gently on the silver tray, their handles fogged. With the cold, he waited for the last assistant to leave before unlatching the lid. The lock snapped louder than expected, like a bone cracking underwater. He opened it only halfway. Inside, gauze soaked to yellow, ribbons of veil, a rosary knotted through, bone, and then eyes. Open. They were wet, clouded with milk, the color of old glass, but unmistakably, unforgettably human. Not the dull, cavernous gaze of the dead, but something else, something still listening. He stepped back, the candle on. The shelf beside him flickered. There was no draught. He leaned in. Breath halted. One of the eyes twitched. It blinked, then blinked again. He dropped his scalpel in the corner of the room. The cracked statue of St. Agatha tilted slightly forward, its chipped mouth fixed in that same soft-lipped expression of perpetual sorrow, its hands missing, as if they had once tried to cover something, and failed. A film of wax had begun to gather on the floor beneath the examination table, but the candle had not melted. The wax had not dripped it had oozed. He did not call for help. Instead, with hands shaking in his gloves, he reached for the camera. He took only one photograph. The flash filled the room with white sath, and in that half-second some trick of the light, or the lens, or the veil itself, he swore he saw the lips move. No sound, only a shiver in the gauze, only breath where no breath should have been. The picture developed wrong. Instead of capturing her fully, the edges of the image blurred into black-like. Ink poured into a wound. Her face was off-center. The eyes, glassy wet, looked directly into the lens. The mouth was slack, but not open, not screaming. Something worse. Composed, as though she were waiting for the photograph to be taken, as though she knew the camera broke the next day. Internal mechanisms rusted from within, despite no moisture present. The assistant who touched the photograph without gloves later reported the feeling of hair in her throat, fine, infant-like hairs, soft and choking. 2 weeks later, the photographer Owen's nephew, aged 25, was found dead in his flat. No sign of forced entry, no note. Only the photo, folded, sealed, and placed in a lead envelope on his chest. He had written one phrase on the back in pencil, pressed so hard it scored the paper. She remembered me. Dr. Sile resigned 3 days after that, gave no formal statement, burned his own copy of the image. He donated the original lead envelope to the diocese for safekeeping, though no one in the clergy ever admitted to receiving it. A cleaner later found it, wedged behind the tabernacle drawer, wrapped in 2 layers of black cloth. She opened it briefly, just long enough to see the image. She would never speak again, but the stains on her bed never left. The file was sealed. The photograph never digitized, the coffin never buried. Instead, it was returned quietly to the stone crypt beneath the east wing of the Dunmurry orphanage. The crypt had no plaque, no cross, just a heavy rust-locked door and a rope of soot hanging from a broken censer like an umbilical cord. Inside the crypt, light did not behave correctly. It bent, slightly, around the box, and on quiet nights, when the wind did not blow and the bells did not chime, one could almost hear something within, a sound not unlike breath, or humming, or waiting. In the years that followed, rumors persisted. Nurses reported finding veils twisted into the laundry, tied into infant-sized knots. Children in the nearby ward began drawing figures with eyes too wide and mouths stitched into smiles. One child, aged 7, painted a picture of the crypt. No one had taken him there. When asked how he knew, he whispered, "She told me." And then, quieter, "She blinked twice." The drawing was burned, the room repainted, the staff transferred, but something lingered. Not the spirit of a girl, not even a girl, but the memory of something carefully unspoken, preserved, not in love, but in terror, not remembered by name, but by effect. She had no certificate, no christening record, no birth date, only a photograph, sealed in lead, only breath inside the box, only eyes, still wet, watching through the velvet dark. Some say the file was buried beneath Dunmari, others that it was sent to Rome. One archivist believes it. Never left the building at all. Don't lead changed rooms. If you ever find it, the envelope, the photo, the sketch, do not open it. Do not look at her, because the last thing recorded in the coroner's notes wasn't medical. It was this: eyes opened, blinked once, blinked again. Subject ceased movement. No pulse noted, but gaze remained, direct. And under that, scrawled by a different hand, in a rushed, shaking script, "We should not have asked her name." No one remembered when the bells last rang in Dunmari Hollow. They remained above the chapel. Yes, cracked bronze mouths furred with soot, swaying soundlessly in wind that never seemed to touch them. But no ropes trailed from them anymore. No names were carved into the pews. Even the hymnals, damp with mold and softened like skin, had no music left between their pages. A village can forget its saints. It can misplace a grave, but to forget its name, that was the kind of forgetting that required intention. Julian Mercer had not come to remember. He had come to disprove. A researcher in disrepair, thinning hair, ink-stained fingertips, teeth worn to flatness from chewing the inside of his cheek. His work for the ministry's archive project had become a kind of quiet exile. Retrieve lost records from parishes with incomplete origin indexing. Reclassify, restore, move on. But Dunmari would not move. He arrived with 2 maps, one from 1846, one from 1892. Both showed the same topography: one road, one church, a schoolhouse. But the earlier map labeled the area St. Vera's Hollow. The newer said only Dunmari, with faint pencil edits scratched beside the borders. Even fainter, a phrase that Julian only noticed when angling the paper toward the chapel: "Windows grey light, do not speak her beneath bells." He assumed it was a joke, an archivist's private superstition, a mid-century prank written by candlelight. But as he stood before the church's wooden doors, one slightly warped with damp, the other bowed inward like a spine held too long in grief, he hesitated. A strange thing, to hesitate over a name. He looked up. The stained glass, the window above the chapel's entrance, had collapsed long ago, its remains gathered like jewels in the soil below. One shard, still intact, caught the late morning sun. It cast a sliver of blood-colored light across the chapel's stone threshold. Julian stepped over it and entered. The interior smelled of iron, mildew, and old wool. His breath clouded the air. He opened his notebook, spoke aloud to orient the record. Dunmari Hollow Parish, entry log, July 3, 2025. Local maps indicate conflicting names. Attempting cross-verification with diocesan archives. The pen clicked. Silence answered. He moved through the nave slowly, his shoes scraping faint trails into the powdery rot that coated the floorboards. Cribs, abandoned in one of the back pews. Too small for infants, too many. On the pulpit, a veil stiffened with soot, its hem sewn not with thread but with white something else. Something dental. Julian did not touch it. Instead, he approached the altar and unfolded the 1846 map. He pointed, softly, to the name, St. Vera's Hollow. He whispered it, just once. The candle on the altar went out. He hadn't noticed it was lit. He exhaled sharply, startled more by the quiet than the dark. And then came the tick, a sound from the vestry, not the creak of old wood, not the scratch of rat's butt, the deliberate tick of metal sliding against itself, like a pocket watch, or something locking. He turned. Nothing moved. But when he returned to his notebook, the ink had bled through the page. Words he had just written were gone, erased, soaked, dissolved. Only one line remained, in an unfamiliar hand. She removes the word when it is spoken. Julian backed away. His heartbeat was rising rationally, he told himself. Low blood sugar, fear of the unknown, atmospheric pressure. But then he noticed something else. The map. The name had vanished from it. Where St. Vera's Hollow had once been, now only a grey smudge remained. He checked the other map. Don Murray was gone too, as if both names had been whispered away. He ran his finger across the parchment. Nothing, not even the pencil scratches remained. The ink, the lines, the letters obliterated with an intent that felt less like censorship and more like rot. And that's when he remembered the priest's letter. It had been filed in the Don Murray folder, single page, never scanned, dated 1871, scrawled in fading ink and punctuated with bleeding candle wax. Julian hadn't paid it much mind before, but the closing line returned to him now, like a tongue pressed behind a tooth. This village erases itself to survive. He looked toward the sacristy. Its door was half open now. Had it been before? From the open space came the sound of bells, but not ringing dot, dragging dot, as though someone were pulling the ropes beneath the earth, trying to wake them from a sleep they'd earned. He moved backwards. The floor groaned beneath his feet. He pulled the notebook to his chest, and a page fell free, a sketch he had never drawn. It showed the church from above, but where the nave should have been was only a mouth, a cavern with steps descending. Its teeth were bells, its tongue a veil. He dropped it. The air thickened, and then, quietly, the vestry door clicked shut. He whispered, Egan reflex, habit, desperation, St. Vera, but the name didn't finish. The second half never left his throat. Instead, his jaw clenched, his breath failed, and the notebook turned blank in his hands. Page after page, lines dissolved, ink pooling like shadow beneath skin. Even the paper began to fray, curling at the corners like burned cloth. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. Only dust, only silence, only the tick closer now, directly behind him. He turned. The bells above the church did not move, but the veil on the pulpit had begun to unravel one stitch at a time, revealing a mouth beneath it. Not carved, not sculpted, organic, pink, with breath that steamed against the wood. She did not speak, she only hummed, a slow, looping tune, like something sung to rocks, to cradles, to graves. He ran out through the chapel doors, into the graveyard, down the road that no longer had a name. But no matter how far he moved from the steeple, the song followed, not in his ears but in his blood. 3 days later, the Ministry of Archive received a package with no return address. Inside, an empty folder, a cracked compass, and a map. The map showed nothing, only one annotation etched into the corner. The bells remember, the village does not. And somewhere, in a parish that refused to be spoken aloud, the bells swayed once more. No sound, only the echo of a name no one had the mouth to say. By the time the humming reached the far end of Belmar Lane, most assumed it was a pipe, a cracked valve beneath the chapel's forgotten crawlspace. But pipes do not sing in lullabies. Pipes do not know the shape of a mother's breath, nor do they pause when a child wakes weeping. It began with the floorboards always at night, always under the bed, just faint enough to be mistaken for memory, a hum just beyond hearing, a woman's voice following an unbroken line of notes, not joyous, not sorrowful, just steady, like thread being pulled between teeth. The children heard it first. Marianne Elwood's Boyd, Daniel, age 6, was the first to repeat it aloud. He sat up one night with eyes still half-dreamed and began to murmur the tune, mouth slack, voice weightless. His words slurred, but the melody was exact. A sequence of 5 notes, then 4, then none. At school, the others joined him without prompting, without knowing why. One by one they began to hum during lessons, beneath their breath, fingertips twitching along tabletops like they remembered rope. That the teacher said nothing. Some closed the windows, others simply turned away. But in the convent, behind the locked door of the archive room, Sister Agnes knew better. She had heard the song before. She had written it in 1927, though the memory refused to present itself fully. It had been during a winter so long and so white the birds stopped migrating altogether. The convent had taken in 6 orphan girls from the collapsed mill at Brackenridge. All were silent. All clutched scraps of fabric or string between their teeth. One of them, Letty maybe, or Alma, had hummed the tune while being bathed in cold water. It ended not in a note, but in silence. That silence had once made Sister Agnes weep. She did not know why. Now, almost 50 years later, she heard the tune again rising from beneath the chapel floorboards, like breath-warming stone. It had not aged, it had not shifted, and she began to hum it back. The others noticed. The abbot stopped her in the corridor one evening and asked if she was feeling quite well. "You've been walking the halls with a tune on your lips," she said gently. "It doesn't sound like anything from our hymnals." "It isn't," Sister Agnes replied. "It belongs to her." Agnes did not answer. Instead, she returned to her cell, sat before the cracked plaster wall where the damp had begun to bloom in veined spirals, and retrieved the paper-aged, creased, yellowed as old teeth. On it, 8 bars of music handwritten, the clefs faded but the notes still visible. Beneath the final bar, a single line of text in Latin, Quantus sine fine, in ossibus manae, a song without end remains in the bones. She had never translated it aloud before, but now, she whispered it, and the floor beneath her chair breathed. It was subtle like warmth pressing through old wood. Not heat, exactly, but presence, an impression left where no body was. Agnes stood slowly, her knees cracking, and knelt beside the narrow vent by the baseboard. She listened, and there it was, fainter than breath, smaller than grief, a lullaby, humming from somewhere beneath stone and soil, but not quite humming. Following night, a child in town, Marin Gray, age 5, screamed herself awake. When her mother found her, Marin had stuffed fabric into her ears until they bled. She could not say why, only that she heard singing through the cracks in her wall, and that the voice was smiling too much. By morning, the floorboards beneath Marin's crib had warped, not outward, not broken, but softened, as though something beneath them had exhaled. By the 3rd day, 5 families had packed up and left Dunmurry Hollow without notice. They left teacups in sinks, stew still warm on stoves. In each home, something had been taken, a handkerchief, a lock of hair, a shoe. But all had been replaced with the same thing, a slip of cloth, threaded through the floorboards, stitched into it, a single broken note. On the 4th night, Sister Agnes returned to the chapel. The nave was colder than before. Damp clung to the stone like fingers clutched too tightly for too long. She walked barefoot, veil trailing behind her like spilled ink. The pews had splintered into grey shadows. The cribs, still there from some ancient christening, were arranged in a circle around the altar, as though awaiting a choir that would never come. She stepped inside the circle, lowered herself onto the cold floor, and began to hum. The song answered her, this time louder, this time closer. It no longer came from below, but from within the walls, the beams, the very breath of the chapel itself. The bells above remained still, but the shadows moved with rhythm. The final note never arrived. It simply stopped, a silence deep enough to hear the grain in the wood. And then came the whisper, not a word, not a language, just the sound of lips parting behind her ear. She turned slowly. No one there, but something had risen, just beyond the pulpit. Something unfurled a length of linen, old and yellowed, billowing from a hole where the floor had once been solid. It twisted, weightless, and Sister Agnes saw it clearly now, teeth sewn into its hem, each one small, rounded, human, a child's milk teeth, 34 of them. The veil moved as though it were breathing, and beneath it, a faint hum, the same melody. She stepped forward, hands trembling, heart slow. She whispered the final note, the one never written. It did not echo, but the veil fell flat. Agnes collapsed to her knees. And for the first time in 50 years, she remembered the child who sang it. Alma. Her name was Alma. She had died beneath the floorboards during the winter of 27. No one claimed her. No one marked her. The others were taken. She was not. She had been forgotten so the village could continue. But she remembered. Her voice had soaked into the beams, into the dust, into the breath of every child that slept in Dunmurry, and she sang to be found. Sister Agnes wept. Until dawn, the chapel stayed silent. But back in the village, on the 8th night, every child woke at once, not crying, not afraid. Humming. In perfect unison, and beneath every bed, floorboards buckled not up, not down, but inward. As though someone had finally listened, and was now climbing out. No one volunteered to open it, not at first. The coffin, though now dry to the touch, seemed to sweat from within. each of its 7 rusted clasps humming faintly under pressure, as if they resisted being unfastened, not from rot, but from memory. It had been 23 years since the first sealing, 11 since the first photograph, and just 3 nights since the children in Dún Mari began humming in their sleep again. The velvet inside, once pressed flat by whatever had been laid within, had begun to rise, not rapidly, not enough to see in motion, but enough that, between morning and dusk, the indent became a dome, smooth, silent, tender as a lung beneath linen. Dr. Fenwick was the only one who didn't flinch when it pulsed. The others stood back, half in shadow, their protective suits rustling like old hymnals. One of them, the youngest, a red-haired pathologist with trembling hands, made the sign of the cross when the first latch opened. Fenwick ignored him. He moved slowly, reverently. He had seen decomposed infants, exhumed from flooded churchyards, had studied the ossuaries beneath St. Agatha's in Prague. But this was neither mummified nor preserved. It did not decay, nor breathe, and yet as his fingers brushed the velvet lip he felt a presence beneath it. Not weight, not warmth, a ... nearness, a sound like distant wool being torn. He paused. The final latch creaked and gave, then silence, deep as snow. They lifted the lid. The velvet inside was damp, still red, still lush, but now slick with a sheen that smelled faintly of warm milk. No body remained, no hair, no bone, only a faint impression in the lining child-shaped fetaland, the 3 breathing holes carved crudely into the base. They steamed in the cold. That was the first note in the log. Interior of coffin emits visible warmth from vented apertures. No biological source. The second came 10 minutes later. Faint rhythmic pulses noted from within cavity. Instruments confirm 58 BPM. No cardiac source. They had placed the stethoscope against the velvet out of habit. No one expected it to answer, but it did. Dr. Fenwick listened first. He said nothing, only closed his eyes. When he handed it to the technician beside him, his face had changed, creased at the edges, like paper held over flame. The heartbeat was not mechanical, not echo, not artifact. It sounded small and young. The red-haired pathologist Carter cried when he heard it. He couldn't explain why. Said it reminded him of lying in his mother's lap during thunderstorms, of breath against cotton, of something that had once rocked him to sleep, though he could not say what. They took samples, of course, velvet fibers, moisture swabs, air readings, but every vial they placed near the coffin turned warm within seconds, as though infused with breath. The lead-lined case brought in to hold the material began fogging from the inside, its sealed glass windows slowly blooming with condensation. Despite ambient temperature, there were no fingerprints, but one of the instruments registered a faint, residual hum. Not auditory subdermal. When Carter pressed the velvet to his palm for testing, his fingers curled inward without instruction. His mouth opened, and for 5 full seconds he exhaled a lullaby he did not know. The others stared. When it ended, he fell to his knees and vomited milk. No one spoke for an hour after that. At sunset, Dr. Fenwick took the last photograph. They hadn't meant to document anything further, and nothing visible had changed. And yet something felt different. The velvet was no longer merely warm. It now breathed back, not up and down, not in a way you could time, but rhythmically, like a hand pressing gently from beneath, only to disappear before you could grab it. So he lifted the camera. One flash, one image, and then beneath the hum of machines, beneath the breath of evening, came a sound none of them could explain. Laughter, not loud, not childish, not cruel, just ... close, as though someone very small had heard. A joke only they remembered. Fenwick dropped the camera. The flashbulb shattered against the floor, and from the coffin's vents, the warm air stopped. Instantly, as if silenced. The heartbeat monitor, FLATLINED. Carter backed away. "It's listening," he whispered, not hearing. Listening. That night, the velvet deflated. Not sagged, collapsed. The interior caved inward, not torn, not punctured, just vanished, as though whatever had been held within it had now withdrawn completely into the lining, like breath drawn back into the body of something too old to wake properly. They sealed the coffin again, burned their gloves, ordered full psych evols for the team. But the next morning, the photograph Fenwick had taken, developed in a lead-lined dark room by a third party, showed something else entirely. Not the velvet, not the breathing holes, but a mouth, pressed against the fabric from Within just lips no nose, no chin just lips, gently open, exhaling mist against the lens. They reported it, of course, filed it, archived it, placed the image in a lead envelope, sealed with wax, but 3 nights later, Fenwick was found in his home mirror, turned backward, milk spilled across the floor, every door unlatched. He'd left no note, just a single audio cassette, labeled only with the word, again, on it, the heartbeat steady childlike, and at minute 7, the sound of someone breathing in, not out, in then, softly. She didn't die, she waited. No one claimed his body, no one reopened the case. But in the lab where the coffin was stored, the new night janitor swears he sometimes hears the locks tremble, not loudly, just enough to remind you something still wants out, something that was never born, and therefore cannot die. The velvet still rises, and the warmth returns. Rain had not touched Don Mari in weeks, yet the chapel steps wept. Sister Agnes had always said it would end where it began, and as the archivist knelt beneath the altar, bare hands tracing the uneven stone, fingers gritted with ash and waxy, wondered if the world had already ended and simply forgotten to fall quiet. The chapel smelled of milk and moss, of stitched veils and old wounds. The hymnals had long decayed, but their impressions remained, rows of pale imprints in the pews, like breath left behind by bodies never born. He had come alone. The others had refused to enter after the bell rang just once, not swung, not tolled, but rung. One perfect note, from a tower sealed since 1911. No rope, no wind, no visible hand, yet the sound had moved through the earth. Even the worms curled from it. He found the tin box just as she described, wedged behind the altar's stone flank, half covered in plaster and a child's ribbon. It was not locked. It did not need to be. Every part of him told him not to open it, but his hand, as if moving of its own breath, lifted the lid. Inside was the letter, folded, fragile, yellowed with silence, and beneath it, a single length of velvet ribbon, damp and still warm. He unfolded the paper. The ink had bled in places, but the hand remained steady, confessional, careful, a scrawl that seemed written by someone who no longer expected forgiveness on their memory. To whomever remains after me, I was the last to sing her name. The archivist swallowed. The wind outside fell completely still, as if the world itself leaned closer. She was not born, she was kept. We were never to speak that truth. They called it a mercy, a sacred stillness, a womb that hummed without conception. But even mercy, when starved, grows fangs. The coffin was not a burial. It was a crib, a prayer box, a chamber for song. We fed her with breath, our hymns, our shame. She drank what we could not say, and in return, she remained asleep beneath us always, just beneath. That was the pact. The archivist paused, heart ticking in the stillness. The air grew heavy. The candle by the altar dimmed, though the wick remained intact. He read on. We stitched her lullaby from our confessions. Every nun added a verse. Every priest tuned the silence between notes. You see, it was never music. It was containment. She was shaped from what we hid, and she remembers every syllable. A small sound echoed through the chapel then. Not a footstep, not a knock, just a shift, like a soft weight settling between pews. He dared not look up. I was 22 when I felt her first exhale. It moved through the floorboards like fever. The child they said would never carry, we carried still, just beneath our feet. They told us she was divine, but divinity does not require sleep. It was us who needed her unconscious. The archivist's fingers trembled. A single drop of wax fell from the candle to his wrist. He didn't feel it. The ribbon in the box twitched, as if exhaling. When the other sisters began to hear her song in their sleep, we told them it was grief. When the milk began to pool at the chapel doors, we called it condensation. When the bells rang on their own, we blamed old iron and rust. But we all knew she was beginning to stir. A low vibration moved through the floorboards, then so faint it could have been imagined. But it passed through the bones. He kept reading. They buried her breath in velvet. But breath remembers, and every time the hymn ends, she takes another sound, another secret, another voice. We never finish the song. We must not. If she wakes, we all remember what we are. The page ended in blood, not fresh, but not old. A single finger dragged down its center. The archivist stood, Too quickly, the chapel did not echo. It absorbed. Outside the wind rose, but the candle would not die. It flickered like a heartbeat, and from below, deep below, he heard it. The lullaby, the same tune recorded in 1927 by Sister Agnes, but slower now, deeper, not in pitch but in place, as though sung not from beneath the chapel, but from inside his chest. Each note dug. He stepped backward, knocking over the tin. The ribbon uncoiled on the stone like a worm exposed to light, twitching, curling toward the altar's edge. He crushed it beneath his boot. It moaned, not in pain, in memory. The bells rang again, but only inside his skull. He fled, out into the night, barefoot, mouth open in a silent scream. No one saw him pass, but the village dogs howled as he ran, and every house he passed had lights that flickered once, and then died. The next morning, the chapel doors were open. No one had touched them. Inside, the letter was gone. The tin was sealed, and carved into the altar, as though etched by a child's finger in butter, were the words, "Don't hum." The velvet was missing. The archivist was never found. But some say, in the middle of night, if the air is wet and the milk spoils quickly, and the bells whispered just once a breath, will move through the cracks in your floorboards. Warm, sweet, patient. They say she's not angry, only hungry, and that silence is no longer enough. She needs another voice, and if you listen closely, you'll forget your name before she finishes the song. They buried her breath, but breath remembers.